Hello everyone. I want to say good morning, but of course it might not be morning. You can watch a video whenever. Good morning, I guess. We're going to start with chapter 22, our land plants. If you took the botany course that I offer here at the school, this is going to be easy review for you. If you didn't, it's going to be a really good chapter. We're going to talk about a little bit of evolution of land plants, but more just how land plants kind of have different ways of reproducing, and the major groups of land plants, which are like mosses and liverworts and ferns and gymnosperms and angiosperms. So it's still really good stuff, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's jump right into some land plant stuff. Here we go. So your book starts with a story about plant diversity and seed banks. Plant diversity is declining, and you guys, of course, know what biodiversity is at this point in the game. We're not really sure what those implications are going to be for things like food, medicine, and other products, because a lot of the medicines we have today are derived from natural plant products. And traditional local plant varieties are being replaced by those from just a few large companies. And so basically, what this means is like um, it used to be that we had many, many, many different varieties of a crop, let's say corn or wheat, and those crops varied by location, and that made our crop base much more diverse. And now we're moving towards one or two or three giant seed companies that produce and distribute all of the seed for all of the farmers. And so we've taken, what used to be, maybe a mixed short grass prairie that was just, abundant with biodiversity, and we've knocked it all down to one species of corn, but we had a variety of species in different locations. And now we've taken those, we've knocked them down to one species of corn that's only produced by one company of seeds, and we've taken the biodiversity and we've knocked it down to really nothing. And so there's some risks in that. For example, there's risks of disease. Certainly, you guys, we know that when we were talking asexual and sexual reproduction a long time ago, we said, the good thing about asexual reproduction is it's quick and it's easy, but the bad thing is if there is a disease, you're all susceptible to it because you're all the same. And that's kind of what it's like if we've got, 15 million acres of, DeKalb corn or Monsanto corn, or, if you've got all of these acres of one type of plant, then one disease that could live on that plant could take out, the whole farm or the whole county or I mean they're saying the whole globe. I don't know if we're gonna have that, but it's possible, I guess. So the more variety you have ensures that some plants are going to resist a particular disease. It's just like diversity in people. It's just like diversity in fungus. Plants are the same way. Diversity is a good thing. That's the benefit of sexual reproduction, right? So, one way to ensure the survival of some potentially useful plants whose natural habitats we are ruining is a seed bank. There's over 1,500 seed banks worldwide, but arguably the coolest one is on this Norwegian island, and it's called the Svalbard Global Seed Bank, and it's near the North Pole, and it's basically like a little metal doorway is above the surface, and the entire bank is below like ice and permanent snow, and it's just very, very cool. And so it's basically like a big, boring library of seeds under the snow. And they made sure that it's the right, it's a good distance away from like earthquakes and blah, blah, blah. And it holds more than 750,000 samples from every nation. So you take how many nations we have and kind of do the math there. Holy smokes. And we're thinking the seeds will survive about 100 years. I wouldn't be surprised if they lasted longer than that, but that way we have a backup. So if we ever decide, hey, that mixed grass prairie was the way to go, but all we've done is plant corn for 200 years, there might be a chance that we could plant some of those grasses from the mixed grass prairie and see what they produce, and then see if there's anything useful from them that we have kind of missed out on because of what we've started to plant. So when we look at plant ancestry, because we're going to talk a little bit about evolution, but not nearly as much as I had anticipated in this chapter, here's what you need to know about plants. Not surprisingly, plants are multicelled. They're not one cell, they are many cells. They're photosynthetic, no duh, right? They make their energy from the sun. They are eukaryotic, so they have nuclei, rough ERs, and Golgis, membrane-bound vesicles. And the story of evolution in this chapter is really a pretty simple one. Adapting to life on land and then progressively adapting to drier and drier climates is kind of the idea. They're pretty close relatives to red algae and green algae, and we look at the type of chlorophylls that they have. Chlorophylls A and B are incredibly abundant, so that's kind of helpful there. They have cellulose in their cell walls, which makes them tough. If you've ever eaten, what's that stuff called? Celery? Yuck. If you've ever eaten celery, then you've eaten a lot of cellulose, just crunchy cellulose and phloem, basically. At this point in the game, you know what chloroplasts are, and chloroplasts have chlorophyll. Chloroplast is the organelle, and chlorophyll is the pigment. Chlorophylls A and B are the most abundant, but like you'll recall from pretty early in the year, there's a whole bunch of different pigments that get different wavelengths at different frequencies. And we call our plants embryophytes, which means their embryos for the next generation of plants are going to form within some sort of chamber of the parent tissue. Might be a seed, might be a fruit, something like that, where they're encased in a chamber of tissue from the I don't know what you'd call it, the first generation of plant, the parent generation of plant, something like that. And they're going to receive some sort of nourishment during that development. When we eat seeds, like let's say you eat sunflower seed, when you eat a sunflower seed, you're eating the nourishment that was supposed to be for that embryo. There's all these proteins and carbs and even some lipids packed into this seed to give that embryo enough energy to grow up. And then we eat that in the form of like pine nut or sunflower seed or something like that. Or grind it up and make it into flour, something along those lines. So here's your diversities of our land plants. We're going to look at bryophytes, which are, I don't know, I kind of want to say simple to complex, but I don't really know how I feel about that. Bryophytes, we're going to look at liverworts. You can see the species 9,000. Mosses, which you've all seen when you're out hiking, 15,000. Hornworts, only 100. I don't think I've seen hornworts, maybe I have. And then seedless vascular plants, basically you could sub in your noggin for that. Ferns. We're going to look at lycophytes, 1,000 species. Whisk ferns, only 7. Horsetails, which we have in the hills, kind of cool, 25. And ferns, which we have in the hills, of course, 12,000. Then gymnosperms, cycads, just think dinosaurs. That's what those kind of look like. Ginkgo trees, only 1 living species today. Conifers is, your pine trees and your spruce trees, and 600 species of that stuff. Neophytes, only 70 species, and those are some weird little plants. And then angiosperms are plants that produce flowers. And so then we have our basal groups of 9,000, and then our monocots and our dicots at 80,000, and more than 180,000. And this is basically a lot of the stuff you're going to buy in bouquets of flowers and that kind of stuff. So that's what that looks like. So let's talk that evolution stuff. I've been looking forward to that. So our first plants probably evolved somewhere around 500 million years ago. And they were able to do that because we had enough photosynthetic cells releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. And as oxygen in the atmosphere reacted with the sunlight coming in, it turned into ozone. And as that ozone layer formed around the entire planet, it protected life on land from the harmful UV radiation. You're not going to be able to live on land with that much UV radiation in the beginning because it's really damaging to your DNA. But with enough ozone around, we can make that transition from algae in the ocean to moss, basically, where you're still dependent on water, but you can kind of sort of live in drier climates, and we can eventually make our transition onto land. And so we look at this alternation of generations, which can be a really confusing thing at first, but I think you guys will master this in just no time. Uh, Plants make spores, and spores are haploid cells inside of a cell wall. And some of these plants have alternating generations between diploid and haploid. And I'm not even sure why they say some plants have alternating generations, because I'm pretty sure every plant needs to have some haploid cells, or it won't make it won't be able to undergo sexual reproduction. At least there'd be no gametes. So let me show you what this looks like. Pardon me. So here's the deal. Um, we have our diploid side here and our haploid side here, and they're separated by fertilization and meiosis. Just like with animals and sexual reproduction in animals, the cycle is very similar. We just have to change some of these words around. So fertilization makes a zygote, right? The zygote makes it starts to grow into a little tiny plant, and that little tiny plant becomes a multi-celled sporophyte. So let's say it's like a pine tree. I don't know. And so that little tiny zygote grew into a pine tree. And then 20 years later, it's a rather tall pine tree. Well, not really. It'd be like, 8 or 9 feet tall. But let's say 50 years later, it's a very tall pine tree. And it makes pine cones. And those pine cones make spores through meiosis. And the spores would be pollen, like in the summertime. The male cones would at any rate. And so they make pollen, which is this little yellow floaty down stuff that coats your car in the summertime if you live in the hills. And those spores are released. They undergo mitosis and make a gametophyte, and then undergo more mitosis and make gametes. And in the pine tree example, some are released earlier in like mosses, but in the pine tree example, they would actually do the spore to gamete thing while they're still in the pine cone. And then at the gamete phase, they would then be released. And if that pollen happens to fly onto a female cone, hopefully of a different tree, and attach to the female cone, then they can fertilize a female ova, or like megasporocyte, and make a new pine nut, which contains the zygote for the next generation. And on and on and on it goes. So we go diploid after fertilization, haploid when they make their own gametes, and on and on and on. It works. Very, very simple. And so then here's your step one. Fertilization is going to make a zygote. The zygote grows. The zygote undergoes meiosis and makes spores. The spores undergo mitosis to make a gametophyte. And the gametes travel, hopefully, to another gamete, fertilize it, and make another zygote. And the only reason this is so tricky is because it looks different in mosses than it does in flowers, than it does in a spruce tree. And that's really the only tricky part. The concept itself is actually the same, but you get all these weird words like microsporocyte, microsporangium, and megasporangium, and it makes it feel more convoluted than it really is. So I guess there's that for you. So let's talk diversity. We've got, like I said, liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Those are your bryophytes. Your bryophytes are going to be generally pretty short. They don't grow all that terribly tall, and they need water to reproduce because they have flagellated sperm. So their sperm swim through the water to a different moss, basically. And the thing with bryophytes that you need to know is they are what's called gametophyte dominant, which is very rare. The gametophyte is larger and longer lived than their sporophyte generation. And this will be kind of cool because once I show you what these look like, you'll be able to see these when you're hiking this spring and this summer. Sometimes these guys are called non-vascular plants. Non-vascular because they don't have true xylem and phloem. They do have some simple water conducting cells, but they are not technically xylem. So it kind of makes sense that they have to live near water and they have to be short, because without that xylem you can't pump water up a stalk. And so most of the moss you're going to see is growing flat, low to the rock, and really tall moss might be like 3 inches or something like that. And so I'll show you kind of what that looks like, and with any luck, you'll see some this summer when you're out hiking. And so then our vascular plants on the other side of that, so our ferns and our flowers and our trees, they're sporophyte dominant. Everything really is sporophyte dominant, with the exception of mosses. And they're larger, they're longer lived. The sporophyte is than the gametophyte, and the gametophyte is this little teeny tiny structure that we put in a pine cone, or this little teeny tiny structure that we put in a flower, and that, but the majority of the plant is sporophyte, and that's what you're going to see. And so those are some transitions to be looking at. Seed plants are vascular plants that hold on to their spores and release them as seeds. That's a really good strategy. This works in flowers. This works in conifers, and they're going to produce pollen. And so there's two lineages that we still have today, which are massive groups. The gymnosperm. Gymno means naked, and sperm means seed. So the naked seed, they're called that because their seeds are not enclosed within a fruit. And so gymnosperms are pine trees and spruce trees and those kinds of guys. And then angiosperms are seeds that are enclosed within a fruit. Now, when you think fruit, don't think like, oh, like an orange or something. Well, not necessarily. A fruit is any ripened plant ovary. It might not be very palatable to us, but any ripened plant ovary. That's what an angiosperm is. And so anything that makes a flower, angiosperm, and you should be in pretty good shape there. So here it is, the first little algae fellow to make it out of the ocean, or maybe you could say population of algae. I might like that almost better. Um, Rather simple line that kind of hangs out by the water, branches into mosses, branches into hornworts, branches into liverworts. We see them having no xylem nor phloem. Their gametophyte is dominant, so all this stuff you see down here, that's the moss you step on, is gametophyte, and just this little weird brown stalk thing is the sporophyte. They absolutely require water for fertilization, like I already mentioned, because their sperms swim, which is kind of cool for a plant. Give them some credit there. And then they don't produce seeds. Then another little ancestral algae, sorry about that, comes over here, and he diverses into club mosses, spike mosses. A different group turns into ferns and horsetails. And so these guys have vascular tissue, so they have true xylem and phloem, so you can get really tall ferns and get that kind of Jurassic Park feel when you're hiking in the right places. And their sporophyte is predominant, so all the big green bushy stuff that you see is sporophyte. They still require water for fertilization because, believe it or not, the sperm of ferns swim. And I'll show you a video if you'd like. It's very weird and quirky with weird science music, like always. And they also do not produce seeds. And so then over here we have more ancestors, and now we're really going to make Grandpapa Algae proud because now we are like a 300-foot tall tree. And here's your gymnosperm. The naked seed plant, they have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. The sporophyte is the entire tree that you see, and then they have little teeny tiny pollen grains. That is going to be their gametophyte basically, and they do not require water for fertilization. They just dust the entire area with pollen and hope for the best. And then the naked seeds are not enclosed with a fruit. And then way over here, a different group is diversified into angiosperms. They have their xylem and phloem. Their sporophytes, the whole plant that we're seeing again. The pollen grains are being produced, and they don't require water for fertilization. Instead, they probably require like a bee or a beetle or a bat or something to pollinate them. And they do make seeds, and they're in some sort of floral ovary that will become a fruit. And those are all our flowers. And so that's the plant diversity we see that's still alive on Earth today, and it's pretty cool. So let's stop there because I feel like I'm pretty close to my 20-minute timeline that I want to shut it off at. So we'll pick up with section 3 next time. Thanks for your time.